Larry Fierro. I saw that Larry Fierro commented there's a Eclipse Night. I thought that was tomorrow night, so I definitely want to check that out.
Oh, it's tonight.
It is tonight?
Well, early tomorrow morning. I think it starts
Okay.
at midnight and goes till about 4 o'clock. It's quite long.
Okay, so we should all look at the sky today.
It's the longest one in 600 years.
Really?
Yes.
Wow. And an eclipse, you have to see. Can you see that, or do you have to look through special glasses?
No, this is this Earth shading the moon, and consequently, you're looking at the moon. You're not looking at the sun, so you don't have any protection.
Good. I don't know if we can see it here, but I'll have a look later.
Well, there should be lots of video things of it tonight, so tune in an astronomy channel.
Interesting.
I'll tell you what, Iris, maybe we should go ahead and get started. It's 5:03, and so hey everybody, welcome back to the Dr. Iris de Rode series that we've been having over the last few months. And we're really honored to have her be a part of this and to provide information about the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route National Historic Trail, with France's involvement and key contributions to America's independence. And real quick before we get started, if you would just everybody check your mute buttons and make sure you're muted. And that way Iris can proceed without being interrupted. We're just really excited to have Iris here, and her background is extensive in research on the American Revolution, on France's involvement with General Chastellux and many more. And tonight she's going to share with us. I will let you introduce the gentleman's name that we're talking about tonight, but we're just excited to hear about these lesser known stories of the revolution and France's participation. And without further ado, live from France, Dr. Iris de Rode. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johnny, for this nice introduction and for organizing this lecture series since I think it's April already. So it's getting a long organization. So thank you very much for that. And also to W3R, the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route Association, long word to pronounce, for organizing this lecture series. And so today I will talk about Vioménil, that's how you pronounce it. Easier to pronounce than Chastellux, obviously. So Vioménil was a very active participant in the American Revolution, and I'll talk about everything you need to know about him today. And so I'll just start with that. So yes, here's a slide. So I came across Vioménil, of course, in my own research on Chastellux during my doctoral research. So he is, of course, a close colleague to Chastellux. He was also serving as a major general in the French army, and he was actually second in command just under Rochambeau. Because of his high rank in the French army, he was selected for that specific role. And I'll talk about what he exactly did in the American Revolution. But so I came across his name quite often during my research and in some books too, in literature. But the problem with Vioménil is that he's quite unknown, and especially because he also has a brother, and him and his brother are often confused. So it's quite a sort of unknown figure. And on top of it all, he's confused with his brother. Sometimes people tend to think it's the same person because they had the same rank and the same name. But of course, they're two different people. So it was always quite hard to understand who he really was and to find sources on him. And one time I was just browsing online, and I found a very small article in a local journal called Le Journal. I have to look it up what the name of that journal is. It's here, Le Journal de Saône-et-Loire. So Saône-et-Loire being a region in France, about this collection of Vioménil. And so Vioménil's collection apparently was held in a place called Le Creusot, and Le Creusot is actually in France, of course. It's in Burgundy, and it's an industrial town. And I'd heard of that because my uncle used to have a home there too, so I knew where it was, but I had no idea that there was actually a large collection of Vioménil held there. And it was quite a surprise because many books refer to this collection as being lost, because his brother's collection, with whom he served, was actually burned just after the French Revolution. And so people assume that that was also the case for Le Baron de Vioménil, on whom I'm going to talk today. However, this was apparently not the case, and it's been preserved. And I'll tell you more about this collection, and especially on where it's preserved, how it's preserved, and all these different things. But before we do that, I want to just talk to you who this person was. But so what's interesting about the collection is, again, it's totally unexploited by historians. And I've been there, I think it was 3 months ago. And in literature, there's nothing about him, but apparently Robert Selig, who's here today too listening, so Dr. Selig has done research in the Baron de Vioménil's collection as well. So I'm hoping that he will have some questions, comments, remarks on the things that he himself has found and how he analyzed it. But what I want to do today is to present the collection to you and to highlight a few of the letters, which I'll quote, and there will be quite a lot of long quotes. So I am aware that that's maybe not the most exciting to listen to me reading, so I won't read the whole thing, of course, but I just want to show what this collection entails and especially what it tells about the American Revolution. And so just for the little story, this collection, as I said, had been thought lost, but it's been preserved in Le Creusot, and it's in this big industrial archive, because Le Creusot is known for its heavy metal industry, not the music, of course, but the metal production. But so the fact is that there was one of the industrialists of the time has bought a castle, and by accident, he found the collection of Vioménil, but not really knowing what it was, he decided to just put it in his industrial archives. And that's where they are still today. And that's also why they're forgotten, because they have no place in the industrial archive. And so they were just placed in sort of the basement and then forgotten from then on. So I'll show you some photos of where that's held today. But let's first have a look at this person, le Baron de Vioménil. So I will start with his youth and his background, and then of course I'll focus specifically on his role in the American Revolution, and then even more specifically on the campaign of Yorktown. So here you can see images of him. It was quite hard to find, actually, because his brother is portrayed more because he became more influential after the French Revolution, while the Baron himself died. And again, what I said already, he's been quite forgotten, but also mixed up with his brother. And so here are the two images that I could find of a younger version and an older version of Le Baron de Vioménil. And kind of the only reason he's known today is for something that he has published at the time, or was published posthumously maybe, but at least they were his letters, Les Lettres Particulières du Baron de Vioménil, of a campaign in Poland. So for posterity, this is why he's known, for this Polish campaign that he's done. But for the rest, as I already said, he's really forgotten. But what I found in the archive is that he was extremely important for the Battle of Yorktown, and it's the development of the Battle of Yorktown, and the fact that, of course, the French won. So I'll briefly talk about his life, his papers, and then focus specifically on his role in the American Revolutionary War and the Battle of Yorktown. And again, what I myself was very excited about is just to discover this figure through his papers, since there's no biography on him, there's almost nothing written on him, while he had the second role and even second rank under Rochambeau, and even when Rochambeau returned to France in 1783, January, he became the general in place of Rochambeau. So he played a very important role, but just no one knows this. So we'll figure out what he really did in a few minutes. But first, I just want to introduce him and his family to you. And so the origins of his family come from Lorraine, which you can see on the map is very close to Germany, and was of course one of the debated parts of France, as you know, with the Lorraine, Alsace-Lorraine things afterwards. But at the time, it was just part of France, and it was the family came from a place called Remiremont, and so the genealogy has been followed back to 1300. So it's one of these old French aristocratic families that has been living in Lorraine for a very long time. And so this family has provided numerous officers to the Duke of Lorraine, the House of Austria too. So some of the family members went to the Austrian side to fight in the armies of Austria, but of course also the kings of France. And this is of course very typical of these French military families that had served in the armies of France, but also European armies where they could find employment. And of course, this is important for Le Baron, a high nobility title. Le Baron de Vioménil came from such a family, making it possible for him to also become very high up in the French army later on. And so his parents, so his dad, his father, also Baron de Vioménil, was the Lord of Belleropt, Bonvilliers, Rupt, Roncourt, and a lieutenant colonel in the regiment of Limousin. So this is a very long name, of course. This is very typical, representative, as I already said, of the French high aristocracy that was serving in the army. And so he was married to Marie-Antoinette Gillet de Vallée. And so they had 3 children, amongst whom the oldest was Antoine Charles, the Baron I'm talking about today, who was born in 1728. And then there was also his brother, Charles-Joseph Hyacinthe, born in 34. So that was the person that was always with him during almost all his campaigns. The 2 brothers served together and occupied similar ranks and had similar functions. So that's interesting. But as for what he did in the American Revolution, I would have to dig a bit further to really know. So I'm really focusing on Antoine Charles today. They also had a sister, Catherine Charlotte. And so Baron Vioménil himself, so the one I'm focusing on today, of who the papers are in Le Creusot today, began his military career in 1740 when he was 12 years old. This is, of course, very young, but that's very typical of the time. These kind of families, the old aristocratic French families, sent their sons, especially the oldest sons, so at the age of 12 to 14, to the army, because it was very important to start young so that they could make rapid advancement, because that was based on what you call l'ancienneté, so anciency in the army. So the longer you served, the higher you could come. So that's why at 12, you would already start. Being, of course, very young, so they were not necessarily very active, but they were trained. And when the war broke out, they would actually be sent to the front too. And so he became a captain. So he reached the rank of captain in 47. And then he started at the War of the Austrian Succession during the campaign, especially in what's now the Netherlands, Bergen op Zoom, in 1747. He got wounded immediately, but that made him quite famous at the time, because being wounded meant sacrifice was good for your reputation in the army. So a few years later, of course, during the period after the Austrian War of Succession, he was training and doing lots of maneuvers and more training to get used to the art of war, let's say, in this period. And then the 7 Years' War broke out when he was himself a colonel in the Dauphiné Volunteers, and then he distinguished himself in the Hanover campaigns, where he commanded light troops. And so this is, of course, important because he gained a lot of experience throughout the War of the Austrian Succession, but also the 7 Years' War, which, of course, would be crucial for his important role in the American Revolution because of his long experience. Of course, this is important because the French, as we know, had these kind of officers that are very experienced and well trained in the art of war and warfare, which of course is quite the contrast to Sorry, there's a microphone still on there somewhere. And so the so talking about these experiences in war, of course, very important because the Continental Army of George Washington had less of these experienced officers. So we'll see that it will become very important for them. And so he was sent just after the 7 Years' War to Corsica too. So this is quite a well-known campaign in France because it's when France took Corsica under its rule, because of course they sent their army to conquer it. I'm not going to talk about details there, but he became more and more famous in the ranks of the army. He had a very good reputation and became the rank or got the rank of maréchal de camp, being the kind of brigadier general, and had the cross of Saint-Louis, which is very prestigious. So what I want to show here, he started, of course, in a very young age, and he rose quickly, steadily, because of his experience, because of his old family name, but especially because of his actions in the wars that he was fighting in. And that's when he was also sent in 1770 to Poland during this war, or the sort of a situation with the confederation of the bar against Russian armies. Again, I'm not going to focus on what that all meant, but it led to the first partition of Poland. So the division of Poland being separated into, given to different powers. And so he served there. And so he became, after that, the Inspector General of the Light Troops. And this is why he became famous, because he did publish some letters about this specific campaign. And so they had very successful operations for a certain time, but then the Russian armies came in and France had to surrender and they left. But so it really led to this first partition of Poland. And what's interesting is that he also served with Kosciuszko, who became one of the important leaders of the American Revolution, the Polish Kosciuszko that also joined the Continental Army later on. But so you can already see some interesting things here in the papers of Vioménil, where he's writing about a fight against tyranny. He's writing for the idea of an independent Poland. And so he's really thinking already about values that will, of course, come back, resonate during the American Revolution. And this first partition of Poland at the time was highly debated in Paris by, for instance, Rousseau, who was seeing this as a real fight for independence at the time already. I would say it's interesting to see some parallels between those who fought in Poland and then would go to America fighting for the same kind of ideas, which could be something I would like to explore a bit further, to see these links, and especially Kosciuszko, Vioménil, these kind of figures that were fighting in Poland and then almost, 10 years later would be sent to America. And so America, 1780 until 83, Vioménil was serving there. And so he was named second in command as a maréchal de camp to, of course, aid Rochambeau in the French Expeditionary Army to assist George Washington. And so he was mainly in charge of logistics during various operations. You can see that he was writing a lot about logistics, about organization of the army. So it's really purely military. His papers don't reflect any ideas about what America represents to him, what the war represents to him, or, for instance, letters with other participants. All that is not happening in his collection, which you can find sometimes in other collections, such as the one in Châteauroux, where it's really also reflecting this hope for the American Revolution. Vioménil's papers are very serious and strict only about the war he's fighting, about the military details. And so you can find very long lists of everything he's doing. He's inspecting all the army units, describing them in great detail, counting literally all the soldiers, counting their shoes, counting their tents, counting everything you can imagine. And it's really to organize, to make sure everyone has provisions, to make sure everyone is well lodged, and so on. It's very logistical. And then he is especially involved in the siege of Yorktown, as we'll see later. I'll reveal some interesting things about that and about his specific role. And then after the departure of Rochambeau, who got ill and had to leave in January of 1783, after that he became the general. And so he was in charge of maybe conducting another campaign, which didn't really work or happen. And then he was sent to the West Indies and from there back to France. So he was in charge of this important French expeditionary army after Rochambeau had left. And so when he came back, the King, Louis XVI, appointed him as a lieutenant, or during the war, lieutenant general, but then after, when he came back, he got the Grand Cross of St. Louis and another sort of promotion. And he became especially the governor of La Rochelle. Governor meaning a military governor who was in charge of inspecting the troops there. And so that meant a very important promotion for him too. And so all this to say that Le Baron de Vioménil already had a very impressive military career. He is a very typical example of sort of this professional officer of the French army of Louis XV and XVI, with a very important experience of the war, which will be very handy for him, of course, during that. So you might wonder what happened to him after the War of Independence. So he stayed in the service of the king and chose the side of the king, we could say. And so he was fighting for the king in defense of the Tuileries, which you can see on this beautiful image here behind the text. And so on August the 10th of 1792, he was injured badly during this sort of siege and the defense of the Tuileries. And then he was forced to hide, so he could not get medical care. And so he died of this wound 3 months later, quite tragically, during this French Revolution. His brother, by the way, stayed alive quite much longer. And so he got married to a person called Gabrielle Marguerite Bourdon, who had 2 children. Of you can see the names there. And so it's, yeah, that's it. That was the end of Le Baron. And so he has a brother, as I already said, called Charles Joseph Hyacinthe, who became a Marquis. He was always at the side, working in cooperation with his brother. They're quite known as being sort of this pair of very highly, experienced officers of the French army. And especially they're seen as always working together. So they're really seen as this block that was always working together for their strategies, for their ideas, for their experiences. And they're often, as I already said, confused. So he became, during the French Revolution, the beginning, he became the governor of Martinique and the Windward Islands. So he lived there during the revolution, but he returned in 1790, but then had to emigrate, as many of these aristocrats, of course. And then he was fighting in the campaigns of the Condé army, and then went actually to Russia and Portugal until 1808. And so during the Restoration, so when the monarchy was restored, he was named Peer of France. It was called the Père de France and Maréchal de France, and then died in 1827. So he had a way longer life than his brother, but I'm not going to focus on him because I don't have his sources yet. I'm sure there will be things to be found, but that's another subject. So the Baron Vioménil, the one I spoke about with his whole entire life, his archives are now to be found here in Le Creusot. So as I already said, Le Creusot is an industrial town known for specifically building trains, but also now more like nuclear elements based on metal that I don't know much about. But they have this beautiful sort of castle still, and they have a part which is now the archive. And so this is where these papers are. And the papers of Vioménil really cover most of his military career. Again, there's nothing really private. There are no like private correspondences with his wife or children or things you might expect from a collection like this, which might just mean that he only kept, or that his family, his specifically daughter, apparently kept the collection after his passing. And they apparently decided to just keep the military side of his life. And so you can see 3 big files on the 7 Years' War. There's an important file on the Corsican campaign, a very large file on this Polish campaign, and then 2, or actually more like 3 big elements on the War of Independence, containing about 550 different files. So file means a document which can have many pages. Then there's also letters from various ministers and army leaders from his whole career. So his appointments, the important moments of his career are reflected in these letters. And then there's also, for the end of his life, on the La Rochelle government that I already talked about. And then there's also his will and death and that kind of stuff. So it's a very large collection, and I would say a very important historical collection that needs to be uncovered. And so for this lecture, particularly, I focus on his part on the American War of Independence, of course, which really covers a large part on the route, what's now the Washington-Rochambeau revolutionary route, is highly represented because he was organizing the logistics of the march, and then particularly of the battle and siege of Yorktown. So on this specific collection of the American War of Independence, between these 3 years, you can find instructions and orders from the ministers of war and the Navy. You can find lots of letters and instruction from Rochambeau personally, so in his own handwriting. You can find reports and statements of personnel and equipment. So that means long lists of numbers mainly. I'll show you a few images after. There's lots of notes on problems of stewardship, discipline, punishments he has to give to people that were not doing what they were supposed to do. And then also reports on the inspections of the troops. So inspection of the troops really means that everything has to be checked. So there are, again, long lists of these units, per regiment, per other parts are all described. So these are quite important for historians because sometimes the numbers are unclear, or the exact amount of people, the exact amount of what they had, the exact amount of money paid, all these different elements appear in these sources that are often kind of scattered and hard to find. So this is quite interesting for that. There's also some requests of officers when they want some promotions, for instance, but then there's also lots of reports on the land and naval operations, official and more private correspondence. So again, private correspondence meaning about the war. It's never about something else, but still these are called private because they're to specific individuals. And then drafts of letters that he sent, and a few personal notes, and then memoranda that are prepared for interviews with Rochambeau, where you can see sort of a preparation with questions and then the answers that will come. So sometimes these are still empty because apparently the conversation didn't take place. So this was a long list, but now I'll just tell you what I found interesting in this collection on specifically Yorktown. So these are images of what I just said about these different reports and calculations, lists of all these different regiments. So for instance, here you can see Newport, what was exactly happening, how much money they had to be spent in Newport at their arrival. On the right, you can see long lists of all the different numbers of soldiers being present in the different regiments because it was an inspection report. So there are many, many, many of these documents in the papers. But I won't focus on that because I'm focusing on Yorktown tonight, where you can see, by the way, Vioménil on this very famous painting of the Surrender of Cornwallis. So the Yorktown campaign, as we all know, is of course the whole campaign of the Battle of Yorktown, but it's also seen as with the long march to Yorktown, on which there's also a lot of information in the archive, but I'll more focus on the end of this campaign because we need, of course, to have some time limits here. And so his function again was logistical mainly. He was also dealing with lots of payments to Americans that were selling provisions or to other units that he had to that had to be paid. He was doing inspection planning. He was organizing reconnaissance tours, or at least giving orders for some to do the reconnaissance for him, to draw maps, for instance, to see where the rivers were, the roads were, all these different things. And he especially gives the orders of Yorktown, as we'll see later. So I'll go through a few of the letters. I already said, and I'm sorry for the long quotes, but while doing research, I got a little bit excited about the entire letters. So forgive me if it looks a bit overwhelming, but I do think the content is very interesting. So for the context, we're now in July 1781. So just for some refreshment of the memory, July 1781 means that they're in the middle of their march to New York. So the French are of course, they arrived in actually a year ago. So in July 1780, they arrived in Newport and they had to walk to join the American army, the Continental Army of George Washington. And from there, they would decide, are we going to attack New York or do we go further to another option further down the road where it's maybe less dangerous than New York? So it was still up in the air where they were actually going. But you can see the reflections of Vioménil here represented in a few of his more private letters that he's writing to French contacts and specifically to members of the French court. So here he writes to the Princess of Vioménil, who was Victoire de Rohan, and she is very related to Louis XV and XVI. And so she is one of these influential women at Versailles. And so he informs her of the situation of the French army. He writes her a few letters like this, in which he just gives information on the whereabouts of the army and what's going on. And so here he writes on 8th of July, 1781, our small army has been joined for 2 days to that of General Washington. We are strong enough to desire to be attacked, but too weak to be able to make any enterprise on New York. So he's already seeing the weakness of the French-American combined army because they've just joined, and he is actually quite panicked at that time, as you can see in other letters too, on the weakness of their army and the very limited possibilities. So he says, all our forces combined do not amount to 9,000 men. In the state of things, I foresee that this campaign will end in this position without any event of interest. So he just believes that they will just be stuck in New York and that they might actually be going back to Newport or just do nothing. Because of course he sees how large that British army is. And so then he says, it's all very well to flatter ourselves that the arrival of Monsieur de Grasse, so of course the admiral with his fleet, will put us out of the inactivity to which we are devoted, but I do not expect it to be soon. Of course, they have heard that de Grasse is going to come, so everyone is happy that there will be more help, so there will be the French fleet and additional soldiers, but no one really knows when they arrive, and they also know that they're very dependent on the fleet, but if they're not there, they can do much. He also knows that he will not bring enough means with him so that we can make the siege of New York. So he is already aware of the fact, again, as I already said, that New York is kind of an impossible mission. This is interesting because lots of historical accounts and in literature, you can mostly find that this decision of going to New York is more taken at the end of July or more in August, based on other things, but you can already see here that the French staff knows that it's impossible. This was already, by the way, the case, as I've already said in previous lectures, in the winter of 1780 and 81, when Châteauneuf mainly and his fellow officers were doing research, reconnaissance missions, and already could see that the British were too powerful, too strong in New York. So this became a problem. But again, he sees this again already here at this time. And so he says that he can reasonably desire that the situation, that our weak representation in America will be sufficient for Monsieur de Vergennes, so the Minister of Foreign Affairs, can assure peace. So he's just hoping for peace, but he doesn't really know how. He's especially hoping that they won't be too destroyed. And so a few weeks later, on 30th of July of the same year, of course, so again, this is prior to Yorktown, they're still based around New York, joined with the American army. And so he's saying how they have arrived there now to the Duc de Châtelet. So again, an influential courtier of Louis XVI. And so he says that according to all appearances, it will end here without any event which could be of interest. And our destiny will be to camp here as long as we have subsistence. But he says, America would be too happy, so it would be wonderful if our position and his, so de Grasse, arrival determined Mr. Clinton to withdraw his generals, or at least to draw the operations to the Carolinas or Virginia. So we already know, of course, that at this time, the French are looking for other options, and of course the Americans too. And so he's already looking at the possibility of going to the Carolinas or Virginia here. And then he also says about the same situation here, that having learned of the 9th of June, so he's talking about, well, let's not go all to these details, but I just wanted to show that he's describing the march to Yorktown quite detailed. So he's describing how the French walked. He's also describing how the Washington's army walked and how they all got together. And I just thought it was interesting to show you this specific quote, even if I don't want to go through it, but it's interesting to see because in his letters, he's describing the march to Yorktown in quite the detailed way. So it could be an interesting source for those working on the route today. And so what's also interesting, of course, is this grand reconnaissance tour that they're doing in July of 1781, on which I already have talked a few months ago, talking about Châteauneuf's role in this grand reconnaissance tour. So as a reminder, the grand reconnaissance tour is at the end of July. The French and American armies combine their forces in order to do sort of this forced reconnaissance, reconnaissance en force, meaning that they're going to check where the British are. They're going to do some sort of fake attacks to see, okay, that's where they're based because they're reacting. That's where they can shoot their cannons. That's where all the army units are standing. So they're picturing and putting in on maps where the British exactly are to understand if we would attack, what can happen. And so Vioménil describes this too. And that's quite interesting because it's to a few historians very known, but most people don't know that this happened actually was sort of a fake attack on New York, which made everyone realize this is really too dangerous. And so he describes that Washington and Rochambeau left and that then some other units left to other places. So they went to the island of New York, they went behind the river of Harlem, from the bridge of Kingsbridge to the point of Mauritiana and then of Honeck and the Sun. By the way, he makes lots of spelling mistakes, or at least as French people at the time, of course, didn't really know how to write. You can see some mistakes, but I left them the way they are. By the way, this is all, of course, translated from French in English for the purpose of this lecture, but everything is, of course, in French. And so he also describes of how this whole reconnaissance is going what it means. And then, of course, he is concluding here. So he's writing a memoir meaning sort of a military report on the arrival of de Grasse. That's the title. But he doesn't necessarily talk much about de Grasse. He talks more about everything that's going on, again, in July of 1781. So what I just said about this reconnaissance in force, all these different units are sent. For a few days, they do reconnaissance missions, writing maps, reports, and so on. And so he also writes this here. He says, in the state of affairs and in the impossibility of attempting the siege of New York, given the insufficiency of the means that the Americans and their allies can assemble for an attack of this importance. So at the end of July, the French know, and George Washington too, that New York is an impossible action to undertake. And so he also says, we have to operate. So I think that there's a need to bring to the south all the French troops under order of Rochambeau and to unite them to a given point with de Grasse, so the admiral that is about to come. So apparently they also know that he's going to go south already, or at least they suspect that. And then to have him operate immediately and with the greatest vigor in accordance with the plan, determined, of course, with Washington and Rochambeau during their particular conferences. So here, of course, he's referring to the Hartford Conference and other discussions that both gentlemen had before in order to see where can we go, what can we do, and have all these plans already quite laid out. So he also, of course, says we will have an unpleasant and humiliating outcome if we go to New York. And so, but he says one should not fear that it will ever be determined by the generals who command us, whose experience and wisdom are so well known that they will undoubtedly make the best and most useful use of the temporary means that they have in their hands for the cause of America. And I think these quotes and remarks really illustrate the thinking of a few of these generals in a very strategic way on what can we do to fight the British, but also their belief and especially trust in their leaders, so Rochambeau and Washington, in their wisdom to make the right decision. And it also reflects this debate on who makes the decision to go to Yorktown. And I think here you can really see that it's a cooperation between the two armies, and it's just sort of a realistic plan that they make based on what they know. I'm just going to pass that one. So there is also, again, he writes to the Duc de Châtelet again, where he says that he has heard that de Grasse is coming. So this is on the 18th of August, he writes about this, but he says on the 11th of August, we've heard that Monsieur de Grasse and Monsieur Barras are coming from Saint-Domingue, and that they're coming the 3rd or the 4th of this month with 28 vessels and 3,200 men. And so they will serve the cause of America. I like that part of the phrase. He always says that the cause of America will be served. But so another interesting point, because some of you might know, but it's always said that they know this on the 14th of August, but apparently maybe it's a mistake, we don't know, but at least Vioménil says 11th of August, they got the news of de Grasse coming, and especially that he's going south. That's more low in this letter. And so now we begin to flatter ourselves that our generals will not lose a moment to use this increase in forces for useful operations. And so he thinks that it will be favorable. So you can feel hope coming back in the mind of Vioménil about the war. Here you can, by the way, see his handwriting, which is quite complicated to decipher, as all these French handwriting specifically, but you can maybe decipher in the middle or up there here, maybe, yeah, here, Washington, for instance, you can read quite clearly. And so he says we should go to Virginia, to the Carolinas or Georgia to attack together with de Grasse, which is also quite interesting because he says maybe he's going to Virginia, but he doesn't really know yet. So it's still vague, but at least it becomes clear we're going further, we're going south. And here he says also that he has heard about the arrival of de Grasse in the Chesapeake Bay at the time. And so what's interesting is that this is one well-known thing where apparently Washington threw his hat in the air out of pure happiness that it was actually coming, that de Grasse was coming. But here you can also see that the event of hearing that de Grasse was arriving in the Chesapeake Bay was felt by the Congress, and bonfires are lit on all sides. The bells and the cries of the people are heard. So apparently it's this joy, overall joy of everyone that's so excited that actually new aid is coming. And then Monsieur de la Luzerne, so that's the ambassador based in Philadelphia, has 2,000 people of all classes at his door, he says, Vioménil said. And so he says the campaign, which was announced very sadly, will end up being as glorious and useful as it has always been tiring. So it was a hard campaign, but there's hope now. So this is all happening during the march to Yorktown. The later letters were when they were still in New York, but now they're going to walk again. So during this, they're hearing about the arrival of de Grasse, they're hearing where he's exactly based, and then apparently all the Americans are cheering and very happy. And so here, Rochambeau writes himself, so you can see also the letter behind on the slide with the, well, you can see a part of the handwriting and especially the signature of Rochambeau, but he's writing a lot, of course, to Vioménil during the march to Yorktown because he's not at the same place. So he's giving orders by letters to his different units. And here he says, I'm going with the General Washington to join Mr. de Lafayette in a chariot. And so he then says that with his brother, together with the Vioménil's brother, they will do the embarkation and they will especially organize the blocking of Cornwallis in such a way that he cannot escape us, if possible, until your arrival. So he says that he wants Vioménil to do a few things, but that he is going to take care, together with Washington and Lafayette, to block Cornwallis. Of course, Lafayette is doing this specifically, but apparently they're assisting him to organize this at this moment. And he also said that he's going to Washington, to his house, so to Mount Vernon, and so obtain from him a more detailed march for Lauzun's cavalry and send it to Baltimore and so on. So he's organizing the march, organizing the different units to be sent to now the Chesapeake Bay, close to Yorktown. And so here he writes at the same time, this is also in September, which is quite interesting. This is a letter, but it's representative of many others, where he's talking about shortages, problems, logistical issues during the march. And here there's specifically one about a real shortage of flour. So apparently there is a shortage of flour close to Williamsburg, which should give cause for concern, especially because it's only enough for 5 to 6 days with flour and also biscuits for the soldiers. So they're getting anxious because during this march they have to provide for food, of course, but it gets more and more complicated the further they go. And so he also says about the difficulties of the march, of the transplantation, the rapidity of the march. Everything becomes complicated, but they're trying to organize it with all the different cities they have to go through. And this is quite, of course, interesting because Vioménil is specifically responsible for logistics. And so he's writing to lots of people about flour, about bread, about biscuits all the time too, but also wood for fire, for the soldiers to make their own fires, and so on. So it's always about how do we get food and how do we pay the food, because food is extremely, I don't know, I can't find a word. It's very expensive. Here we go. It's a very expensive thing to buy everywhere. So they have to organize themselves. And that's one of the main parts of his letters. And so when they arrive close to Yorktown, he has a plan. And what's, I think, one of the most revealing aspects of this collection of papers is that you can see that Vioménil apparently takes command during Yorktown. And maybe some of you knew this, but for me it was a real surprise because I haven't really read it anywhere else. And so he says on October 10th, the health of Rochambeau having made it impossible for him to supervise the opening of the trench and the work done in front of York during the first 8 days. So apparently he was too ill to command and asked his second, Vioménil, to take over for him. And so then he writes about himself, Monsieur Vioménil, who had replaced him as best as he could, and who had judged from the 10th of October onwards that it was impossible to remove the redoubts, which were covering with advantage the entrenchment of Cornwallis, gave the general the following memorandum, requesting him to have Washington approve the execution. So apparently it was all approved by Rochambeau and approved by Washington on the 14th. And so this is quite interesting because it's the project that Vioménil has designed on attacking Yorktown. Of course, based on many other reports that were circulating with ideas, but he put it all together and apparently actually even replaced Rochambeau during this specific moment in the Battle of Yorktown. And so when they start the Battle of Yorktown, he's commenting on the fact that Lord Cornwallis seems to be very weak, because he says that he has not done much. He has abandoned some of the redoubts. He was very inactive when the trenches were opened, and he has very little artillery. And so it shows lack of resolution or weakness in the eyes of Vioménil. And that's, of course, the opportunity for them to attack. And so he says that there will be no inconvenience in attacking by force the redoubts, which are in front of his left and which serve him as a great protection. So he's found the place to attack him and to actually, get a sort of victory out of there, because that's the weakness of Cornwallis. And so he says also, after we will have been beaten for 24 hours by the British, will be beaten by the American artillery and by those of the batteries of cannons and mortars, which can be directed on the views of the faces, doors, and projection. So it's a whole plan of attacking. And this is a very long project, by the way. I just put a small, or quite a long quote, obviously, but a small part of it just to show how specifically they detail all these ideas on how are we going to attack. And it's this very long idea and detailed list. And he also describes how to burn abattis, how to burn redoubts with combustible materials, and then forcing the enemy throughout the whole night by simulating attacks on their front, and so on and so on. So it's all these ideas to attack them kind of unexpectedly at night when they sleep. And then he also discusses this again: when they usually sleep, we will attack. So all these ideas have, of course, been approved by Rochambeau and Washington, because they are the actual generals. And so he says, if they approve it, we will just put it into action. And so they did. Another interesting letter that is in the papers is this specific letter called Orders and Instructions for Lafayette concerning the attack on the redoubts of Yorktown. So here again, we have seen that Rochambeau cannot give orders and that Vioménil takes over. And so he writes directly to Lafayette the orders of the 14th of October, which is one of the most important moments in the Battle of Yorktown. And so thought through by Vioménil. So at 5 p.m. specifically, he says that Monsieur Lafayette is warned that after a silence of a quarter of an hour from all of our batteries, so total silence, 2 large bombs and 2 shells will be fired tonight at 6:30 precisely from our first parallel, and 2 small bombs from the second. And so that will be the signal for Lafayette to bring out the American and French troops who must attack the redoubts on the left and the enemy with great force. And then, of course, he had to attack another redoubt, and there is a longer explanation on all the things that have to be done, which I won't discuss now, but it really is, again, a very detailed explanation of what he has to do. And so as soon as he has the redoubt, and he's done all these different aspects that were discussed before, he says it will be occupied by the number of men that he believes necessary to defend it against enemy attacks. And so this all leads to establishing communication and asked by the French, and so there will be a protection of night workers, communication with batteries, and so on, in order to make this a success. And then when everything is taken in place for the preservation of the redoubt, so if the redoubt is actually taken, he will have to go to Vioménil himself, whom he will find in the redoubt taken by the French, so another one, so that he can give new instructions on what he will think best to do for the rest of the night and for the service in the trench. And then, just a fun side note, what he writes at the end is, Lafayette will directly instruct Washington of his success. It is a pleasure that Vioménil likes to leave to him. So he will leave the glory to Lafayette, but behind it all is Vioménil and his strategy of getting the redoubts. And he's also ordering one of these similar instructions to von Steuben, who is, of course, the Prussian famous officer of the Continental Army too. And so he gives orders on the same moment to von Steuben. And so here he says that he has to guard the redoubt and the parallel guarded by the Americans occupied for as long as the attack of the Marquis de Lafayette lasts. So von Steuben is ordered to protect Lafayette, let's say. And so also, if ever Lafayette doesn't succeed, he will be there as sort of a backup plan. And so He will also have to comply with other provisions of the trench that has been verbally agreed upon between him and me in this regard. So all these different orders and plans for Yorktown show that Vioménil has a much more important role in the actual development of the battle and the strategic thinking of the battle itself. That is, of course, quite forgotten today. And I think that this is the key of these papers, or these few letters that just really show that it wasn't Rochambeau himself, more indirectly, but it was Vioménil that was sort of the mastermind behind a few of the actions. Of course, he was not the ultimate mastermind of the whole campaign, but there were a few of the details that were really his and that are completely underappreciated today, which means Vioménil needs a bit more attention, I would say, from historians there. So as for, just to conclude, of course, he, as I said, became general when Rochambeau was about to leave. And so here you can see that when he arrived in Boston, he received a nice letter from the inhabitants of Boston that thanked the French for their aid, for their service in the American Revolution. And so he says, or they say, the inhabitants of Boston, that they want to congratulate His Excellency, how now the Baron de Vioménil is called, who is the commander of the army at the time, so that they're very happy on the arrival in the capital of the Republic. And so he says that they're just inspired by the sentiment owed by the faithful allies to the sovereign king and the nation he so wisely governs. And so they thank the French king, and especially, of course, Rochambeau and his whole army for saving America. And then they are especially talking about the qualities of the Navy and land troops. And they say the whole country attests to the perfect discipline, good order, and zeal which distinguishes them. And they said, may our happy alliance with France never weaken, which of course is quite interesting to say, because they have hopes for the future of the French-American relations here. And so also the alliance for which so much was spent, so many precious lives exposed, so much blood, and so generously offered. And may the mutual fruit of the alliance perpetually be preserved. And then Vioménil himself, of course, answers to this. This is not up to me to receive these flattering testimonies. It should go to Rochambeau. But maybe these Bostonians knew a bit more about his role in Yorktown, who knows? And so, of course, he is also taking the time to express his admiration for General Washington. And then, of course, that he's also believing in the duration of the Union and the great advantages which result from it in all times for both nations. So putting this emphasis on the importance of the French-American alliance for the years to come. So that was it for today. A lot of information on Vioménil and a lot of quotes, but overall what I wanted to show is that this is a very important figure of the American Revolution that has been forgotten, but that can be newly appreciated today because of this newfound, or at least sort of rediscovery of the papers of Vioménil in this archive in Le Creusot that is now open. It was already open, but not very exploited. So now I would say it's time to do more research there. So if there are some questions, I see that there are some.
There's a couple questions in the box. Larry Fierro asked, the handwriting in this letter from Condé is more clear than the previous. Did he use a scribe? Just wondering if you might know.
Oh yeah. Oh, did he use a scribe? I would say yes. What you can often see is that so there are drafts and there are sort of the more official letters that are written, and so often they would have secretaries to write the official versions, and they would keep their own draft. So you can see a difference between the handwritings very often in these kind of collections. So I would say it's quite probably that he did use other people to write for him too. So I'm going to the first one. Okay, about the eclipse. Yes, I hope I can already see it here. And then Larry also commented on Le Creusot, where you get pots, pans, and cannons. Yes, indeed. Le Creusot has Le Creuset, that famous orange sort of, I think it's called Dutch pot in America, but anyway, it's important for that, indeed. And of course, cannons, lots of arm industry for sure. And then there is a comment of Robert Selig saying, Le Concorde arrived in Newport on the 11th of August, but the letter she carried arrived at the hotel house in Greenberger the 14th. That's a good addition. So the fact is indeed that we saw that he said 11th, and then apparently they arrived 3 days later for everyone. But that's an interesting addition for that.
Yeah.
And then
just real quick, I just posted something. I don't know if you can see this about Vioménil from an unpublished account of the storming of number 10 about Vioménil, if you want to read that, because he apparently rides up to the redoubt on horseback in full uniform.
Okay.
Okay, you see that at the bottom? You know, or everybody else can read that too. By the way, if I may just say that, Iris, yeah, this is the Vioménil papers are clearly very important. They have rarely ever been used, and they are. There's something in there for everyone. For reenactors love this because they got all the details, the inspection reports every 6 months, how many swords were lost, what the uniforms look like, what changes were made is in there. The correspondence is fascinating. The orders for the assault on redoubts number 9 and number 10. I'm actually writing an article about that using Vioménil, for example, in there. If you want a breakdown of the wagon train that goes to Yorktown, it's in there. I used it in my Virginia report, actually reproducing some of the pages with the names of the butchers. I mean, the details are in there that are fascinating, because he was the organizer of this march there. So yeah, I'm glad you're talking about some of these details. I hope you get a larger audience than what I seem to be getting up, because these papers are really, as I said, there's something in there for everybody. Really, Grant, the letters, the correspondence with the Seguir, for example, about issues of discipline. I mean, you name it, it is in there. Especially if you, as the more and more is coming out, even though people don't believe, it's hard to believe that there's still diaries and journals like the Dumas journal that you had that are lying around, or you play the Catignon and others that are only slowly now coming to light, filling out our knowledge in there. So thank you very much. Now I go back in my cage.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I totally agree with you on the variety of the sources that tell us many different details on the American Revolution and his role. And then beyond that, there's also the Corsican, Polish, Austrian campaigns, 7 Years' War. So there's indeed a lot for everyone, we could say. So it's an important collection indeed. And I am actually working now with the it's called Fondation, that it has it now, but to make it accessible for the historical community by digitizing this collection. But it will take quite some time to actually organize, but they have agreed upon that idea. So yes, there's a lot to say and a lot for me to understand better too in this collection, because it's very large. And it could totally serve to write a biography on Vioménil sometime in the future.
Yeah, that would be great, especially the papers of the American War, if they were digitized. I have scans of the 74 and 75, but there's so much more out there.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what the plan is, at least. So yeah. So going to the next question of Larry Ferrero, what do we know of Rochambeau's illness during and after Yorktown, and was it the same illness responsible for his return to France? So what I know, maybe Robert knows more about the specifics of the disease, but what I've read in some other papers is that he had, in French, it's called rheumatisme. So it's, I don't know how you call that, Roma, I don't know how you say that in English, but it's something with painful parts of your body, I think. So apparently he had these kind of attacks where everything started to hurt, which might be something that we know now as another disease, but I remember that was arthritis, okay. So a disease that made him suffer a lot. And I also remember having read that he had this wound in his leg because of an old wound that was always infected and always getting bad, with creating fevers, creating infections. So it might have been a combination of these two. But also if you read his biography or description of his life, there's a lot of moments, like crucial moments in the wars he's fighting, that he's too ill to perform. And so that's also the case during the War of American Independence. And it is the reason for his return to France before the rest of the troops, which is indeed quite remarkable that the general himself leaves before the rest, but he was indeed quite ill and complaining about that sometimes too. And some of the officers are writing about that they're concerned of what are we doing without him. And there is a talk of who is going to be the general that replaces him, and that's Châteauneuf or Vioménil, but okay.
I just see this question here by Mr. Dembowski about the Grand Reconnaissance. In this report that I did for the town of Greenberg, which is also on our website here, there's I have about a 50-page account of the Grand Reconnaissance, using again in part Vioménil's papers, and they said additional accounts have been found, have come to light since then. Dillon's account, for example. But that's if you go to our website there, and it's on the report on the town of Greenberg, there is about 30 or 40 pages account on the Grand Reconnaissance in there.
Yeah, that's an important document, because it's really, there's not much to find on the Grand Reconnaissance in general. It's one of these episodes that is overlooked, I would say, of the whole campaign. There's a lot to find too in the Châteauneuf archive, but in Vioménil's archive, there is, I would say, even a bit more about just how it was in generally organized. He's writing in a few letters about lots of details about it. I quoted one briefly, but there's much more to find on the specifics, where they actually went, what went wrong. He talks about, for instance, this one horse that got shot under an officer, and then apparently some English died in the same attack. All these kind of details are to be found in there. So that's interesting. So last question, does Vioménil merit a statue so he isn't forgotten? I would say yes, he is. He should be represented on Yorktown for sure, on the Yorktown battlefield, since he was quite relevant and important there, of course. So if there's no further question, I'll go and look at the eclipse now.
Thank you for a great program, Iris. Really appreciate all your hard work, and this was a lot of great information. And go enjoy that lunar eclipse. I guess it's midnight there in France now. So thank you again, and look forward to having you join us again soon.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.